I've seen a lot of terrible things in my line of work. Animal cruelty cases that keep you up at night. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the moment I heard my 8-year-old daughter scream from our backyard. It wasn't a cry for attention, and it wasn't even pain, it was pure panic, the kind of sound that comes out of a child when something sacred is torn away in front of their eyes. By the time I ran outside, it was too late. The wood chipper was still spinning, bits of fur in the air. And Karen, the self-appointed HOA queen, was standing there like she had just thrown away a bag of leaves instead of a trained service animal that meant the world to my little girl. I froze. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I had to choose between comforting my daughter and arresting a neighbor. Karen didn't know who I was. She didn't know what I did for a living. He thought she'd get away with it. She didn't. Saturday mornings are sacred in our home. It's the one time of the week where the world slows down just enough for us to breathe. I brew a fresh pot of coffee, my wife reads on the back porch, and my daughter Emma gets her special time in the backyard with Maple. Maple was more than a dog. She was a trained support animal, gifted to Emma after 2 years of therapy and evaluations. Emma was born with a rare neurological condition that made sensory processing difficult. Loud noises, sudden changes, even simple tasks like tying her shoes could trigger a meltdown. But with Maple, something clicked. That dog could sense things even we couldn't. When Emma felt overwhelmed, Maple would nudge her hand gently. When she had trouble breathing, Maple would lie next to her and slow her down. She was Emma's calm in the storm. That morning was warm and clear. Maple was chasing bubbles while Emma giggled, her feet kicking up grass clippings as she ran in uneven circles. I had just stepped inside to grab a refill on my coffee when I heard it. A scream. Sharp, piercing, real. I dropped the mug. It shattered against the tile as I tore through the sliding door, heart in my throat. Emma was on her knees, clutching empty air. Her arms were out, reaching. And beyond her, in the shared space between our yard and Karen's, I saw the machine. A rented wood chipper. Bright red. Loud. Running. And beside it, Karen, holding a rake like a baton, looking at the machine with zero urgency. At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw the fur, light brown, floating like confetti. I swear for a second, the world tilted. My legs stopped working. My throat clenched so tight I couldn't speak. Emma turned toward me and just kept repeating, "She threw her. Daddy, she threw her." I walked, not ran, walked, every muscle trying to hold itself together. Karen was already walking toward her patio. I called out her name. She turned around with a look I'll never forget. She said, "You should keep your mutt on your side of the property." I stared at her, speechless. She added, "It was barking and scratching. It looked diseased." I took a breath, deep and sharp. "She was leashed," I said. "She was on our lawn." Karen rolled her eyes and waved her hand. "I warned you about that animal. It shouldn't be around children. It could bite." My daughter was still crying behind me, her small body rocking back and forth in a way she hadn't done since before we had Maple. My wife had come out by then, wrapped Emma in a blanket, held her like her world had collapsed. Because it had. I turned back to Karen. "Do you know what you just did?" I asked. Karen put her rake down and muttered, "It was just a dog." Those 4 words cracked something open in me. Not just as a father, but as a federal officer, specifically an officer with the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. My job is to investigate and prosecute animal abuse cases. I've arrested smugglers, shut down illegal labs, and walked into homes that made me sick. And now Here I was, staring at a woman who had just ended the life of a registered service dog like it was garden waste. She didn't know who I was, not yet. I didn't tell her, not then. Instead, I called local animal control and reported an act of cruelty. I gave my badge number, stated my agency, and asked for an urgent response. Karen smirked when she heard me on the phone. "You think calling your little friends will scare me?" she asked. "This is my yard, my HOA. I followed protocol." "You just committed a felony," I replied. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or scoff. I said nothing more. Instead, I walked back to Emma, who had stopped crying but was now staring into space. Her hands were clenched, her fingernails digging into her palms. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Maple's gone." I crouched down beside her and nodded. "I know, baby," I said, "but we're going to make this right." That night, after Emma finally fell asleep, curled in the sheets that used to smell like maple, I opened my laptop. I logged every detail, every word Karen said, the footage from our security cam, the time-stamped vet records, the ID tag from Maple's collar. I didn't need permission to open a federal case, not with what I had seen. I knew this wouldn't be a slap on the wrist, and Karen had no idea what was coming. Next up, Karen doubles down with excuses and lies, but my badge, the law, and Maple's memory will break through her web of denial. The animal control officer arrived within 20 minutes. Young guy, maybe mid-30s, but professional. His demeanor changed the moment I handed him my badge. I wasn't just a grieving pet owner to him. I was a federal agent filing a report. The clipboard came out. The tone shifted. We weren't neighbors anymore. We were witnesses and suspects. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, sunglasses on, like this was a minor inconvenience. She didn't offer to walk over, didn't ask about Emma. She just kept muttering things like, "This is ridiculous," and it was barking again. Someone had to do something. The officer spoke with her first, gave her every opportunity to explain. She said the dog was loose, that it charged her, that she panicked. Then, in the same breath, she said she had warned us about that mutt for months, and we hadn't listened. Her story shifted every few minutes. I watched her closely. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble. She was so sure of herself. That entitlement, that smug certainty, that the rules didn't apply to her because she wore a polo shirt with an HOA patch and ran the neighborhood newsletter. But this wasn't her newsletter. This was a criminal investigation. I handed the officer Maple's documentation, her service certification, her training records, her veterinarian's behavioral assessment. I showed him the footage from our backyard cam. You could clearly see Maple on her leash, attached to a ground stake in the grass, while Emma played nearby. Karen wasn't in the footage, but there was a 10-minute gap where Maple vanished, and the wood chipper was already in motion. The officer took notes, asked me to email everything. Then he walked over and asked Karen point blank if she had touched the dog. She said, "It came onto my property." He repeated his question. He paused, then said, "I didn't realize it was a service dog. It didn't have a vest." He looked at me. I replied, "It had a vest. My daughter took it off when she was brushing Maple's fur." Karen shrugged. "Well, that's not my fault, is it?" The officer took one last note and said, "Ma'am, I'd advise you not to say anything further." She bristled. "Amy, are you charging me with a crime for protecting myself?" He didn't answer, but I could tell he had heard enough. 2 hours later, I got a call from a local detective. He confirmed that Karen's actions were being reviewed under both state animal cruelty laws and the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, given Maple's designation as a service animal. And once that door opened, I walked right through it. I contacted my supervisor and informed him of the situation. Full transparency. I wasn't investigating it myself, but I had evidence that could support federal charges. My supervisor told me to document everything and stay clear of direct involvement beyond the witness level. But I didn't need to investigate Karen to bring her down. I just had to let the truth speak louder than her lies. That week, Karen doubled down. She started telling neighbors that I had let a dangerous animal roam free, that Maple had attacked her once before, that my daughter's so-called disability was an excuse to let a wild dog terrorize the neighborhood. It made me sick. I got anonymous notes in my mailbox. One read, "Maybe keep your freak family inside where they belong." Another said, "No dog deserves to die, but maybe pick a safer breed next time." I knew they came from Karen's circle. She was rallying her people, painting herself as the victim, saying she was being harassed by a government agent with a vendetta. She didn't mention what Mabel actually meant to my daughter. She didn't care. But others started seeing through her. Evelyn, our next-door neighbor, came over with a homemade casserole and tears in her eyes. She remembered how Maple used to sit patiently on the porch while Emma read aloud. How she would never bark, never chase squirrels, just quietly wait for Emma's words to slow before nudging her side. She was special, Evelyn said. Anyone who knew that dog knows Karen's lying. I started getting more messages. Emails from parents who had support animals for their kids. Calls from veterans who had seen service dogs in action. A letter from a woman across town whose blind husband had lost his dog in a hit and run. They all said the same thing. "Don't let her get away with it." "I won't," I wrote back. By week's end, Karen received her first official notice of pending charges. The county prosecutor confirmed that the evidence met the threshold for felony cruelty and destruction of a federally protected service animal. If convicted, she could face up to 5 years in prison and tens of thousands in fines. She went quiet after that. No more Facebook posts. No more HOA meetings. Just silence. But justice was only beginning. Next up, Karen faces criminal charges, public shame, and a media storm she never saw coming. And this time, she's not the one controlling the narrative. When you've worked in federal animal protection long enough, you learn to spot patterns. People like Karen don't see animals as living beings. They see them as property, obstacles, or worse, nuisances that can be removed without consequence. But this time, she picked the wrong family. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted accountability. Maple wasn't just a dog. She was federally recognized as a service animal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. What Karen did wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. And she didn't just traumatize a child, she destroyed a lifeline. Once the charges were filed, the story didn't stay local. A reporter at the city's biggest newspaper caught wind of it. The article dropped on a Wednesday morning. The headline was blunt. "Away, president under investigation after service dog thrown into wood chipper." They didn't use names at first, but in our neighborhood, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Within 24 hours, Karen was trending locally on social media. Photos of Maple, her certification card, and Emma's drawing of her holding Maple's leash were circulating online with hashtags like Justice for Maple and Hope Karen. Karen tried to stay quiet, but that didn't last long. By Friday, she gave an interview to a local news station. She wore a cardigan and a pearl necklace, sitting stiffly on her floral couch, and said she deeply regretted the incident. She claimed she had no idea the dog was registered, that it was barking aggressively, and that she was only acting in self-defense. but the footage said otherwise, and so did the police report. Her calm demeanor couldn't erase the fact that she had taken matters into her own hands without evidence, warning, or logic. The machine was hers. The act was hers. And now the consequences would be too. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. During that time, the HOA board voted to remove her from her position. Officially. Permanently. Her name was scrubbed from the newsletter, the website, and every public record of board leadership. Her former allies stopped replying to her emails. Some of them even apologized to me and my family. But not Karen. She sent me one letter, just one. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't even kind. Typed, single space, printed on plain white paper. It read, "You've made your point. I hope you're happy." I didn't respond. Instead, I poured my energy into Emma. She cried herself to sleep for days. Woke up reaching for Maple, only to find an empty rug and an old toy bone. We had talked about getting another dog someday, but it felt too soon, too unfair. So we focused on healing. We drew pictures. We read stories. We made a little scrapbook of Maple. Photos, memories, even her adoption certificate. Emma took it to therapy and shared it with her counselor, who said it was one of the most mature responses she had ever seen from a child who had lost a companion. Meanwhile, the case gained traction. An advocacy group for service animals reached out. They offered to cover our legal fees if Karen tried to sue again. They also said they would nominate Maple for a posthumous service award at their annual conference. It wasn't much, but it felt right. Emma helped me write the submission. She wrote, "Maple wasn't just a dog. She was my best friend, my protector, and the only one who could help me when I couldn't help myself." That line broke me, because she was right, and that's why I kept going. I gave testimony in front of the district attorney. I presented a full incident report from my agency, documenting how Karen's actions had violated multiple federal guidelines regarding protected service animals. I made sure they understood exactly what Maple meant to Emma, and what her loss meant for every child who depended on an animal just like her. When I finished, the DA simply nodded and said, "We're going for the maximum." Karen was officially charged with felony cruelty to animals, destruction of a federally registered service animal, and violation of ADA protections. It wouldn't bring Maple back, but it would make sure Karen could never hurt someone like that again. Next up, Karen walks into court, but her carefully crafted image collapses in front of the judge. Her lies don't hold, and the world gets a front-row seat to the justice she never thought she'd face. The courtroom was small, almost unimpressive. Pale walls, worn carpet, a handful of pew-style benches for seating, but to me, it felt like the center of the world. Like every injustice we had swallowed, every tear Emma shed, every moment we sat staring at the empty dog bed. It all led to this one place. Karen arrived, flanked by her attorney, dressed in beige like she was attending a book club, not a felony hearing. Her eyes scanned the room, confident, calculating, until they landed on me. I held her gaze. Not with anger, not even with hate, just clarity. She looked away first. The courtroom was filled with people from the neighborhood, some I barely knew, others I hadn't seen in months. Evelyn sat 2 rows behind me with her hands folded in her lap. A teenage boy in a wheelchair rolled in with his mother. He wore a shirt that read, "Service dogs save lives." Someone else held a photo of Maple in a small frame. The judge entered, the bailiff called order, and just like that, it began. The prosecutor opened strong. They outlined the charges, introduced Maple's registration and the ADA protections she carried, Then they showed the footage. That same camera view from our backyard. Emma playing, Maple at her side, leashed and peaceful. The video paused when Maple disappeared off frame. Then they introduced the police report, the animal control notes, and the timeline of Karen's contradictory statements. Karen's attorney objected often. He said the incident was a tragic misunderstanding, that Maple was unsecured, that Karen feared for her safety. But the facts were stubborn. The footage didn't lie. The leash was visible. The wood chipper was running. And Maple never barked once. When I took the stand, I wasn't sure I could get through it. They asked me to describe Maple, her role, her temperament. I tried to stay clinical, like the reports I'd written before. But my voice cracked when I said Emma's name, when I talked about what Maple meant to her, when I described Emma's silence that first night, her sleeping on the floor, the way she clutched Maple's old collar in her fists. I saw Karen look up at me briefly. I don't know what she saw in my face, but she turned away again. And then Emma's therapist testified. She explained how children with sensory disorders develop bonds with service animals that go far beyond the normal child-pet relationship, that losing such a companion isn't just grief, it's trauma. The defense didn't even try to cross-examine her. The final witness was a federal colleague of mine. He wasn't there in a personal capacity, but as a subject matter expert. He outlined the laws Karen had violated, step by step, confirming that Maple was a protected animal under federal law and that her destruction qualified as a felony. Karen didn't testify. When the judge asked if she wanted to speak, she shook her head. Her silence was louder than anything she had said before. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and court-mandated psychological evaluation. She was also ordered to pay restitution, including the cost of Maple's training, therapy for Emma, and a $25,000, 0 cents, donation to a National Service Dog Foundation. No one clapped, no one cheered. But the silence this time wasn't heavy. It was healing. Outside, reporters waited, microphones angled, questions flew. I didn't answer many, just one. A woman asked, "What would you say to Karen right now if you had the chance?" I looked straight into the camera and said, "I'd tell her Maple was the best part of our lives. And now she's the reason the rest of our lives will be better. Because no one will forget what happened. Not because of hate, because of truth." That clip went viral. The story made national news. Donations poured in to the Service Dog Foundation, named in the judge's order. Volunteers signed up. A scholarship was created in Maple's name to fund service dog training for children with disabilities. Emma smiled when I told her. "She's helping other kids now," she said. "Yeah," I replied, holding back tears. "She really is." Next up, a new chapter begins. We try to move forward, and Maple's legacy becomes more than just memory. It becomes hope. The days after sentencing felt like standing in the sun after months of rain. You're not exactly warm yet, but the chill is finally lifting. The house was quieter now, but not in the heavy way it had been after Maple was gone. It was a gentler silence, one that made room for healing. Emma still had rough nights. Some mornings she'd wake up and reach for Maple's collar like it might still be there, but they were less frequent. Her therapist said she was making remarkable progress. I knew why. Kids are resilient, yes, but Emma had also found a purpose. She started writing stories about Maple. Not just memories, but adventures. One day Maple was a superhero who saved the school from invisible monsters. Another day, she was a pilot, flying rescue missions. Emma even drew pictures to go with them. And when she read them out loud, her voice didn't shake anymore. We framed her favorite one and hung it in the hallway. At school, Emma's classmates held a moment of silence during a special assembly about service animals. Her teacher told me several kids asked their parents how they could help support people with disabilities. That might sound small, but it wasn't. It meant the message landed. Maple mattered. Her life mattered. As for the neighborhood, things changed too. Karen's house was listed for sale 2 months into her sentence. Rumor had it she was moving out of state. No one protested. No one gathered signatures or made a fuss. She left the way she had lived there. With control, but no community. The new family who moved in brought a golden retriever puppy with them. His name was Bruno, and he had the same goofy energy Maple used to have. Emma met him one afternoon, kneeling slowly to let him sniff her hand. She giggled when he licked her cheek. It was the first time she had laughed that hard in months. We're not ready for another dog yet, but maybe someday. For now, we're focused on keeping Maple's legacy alive. A scholarship fund in her name reached its first-year goal in under 5 weeks. 3 children with autism received fully trained service dogs this spring because of it. Emma got to meet one of them at a community picnic. His name was Tyler, and his new dog Rosie never left his side. Watching them together brought tears to my eyes. Not sadness, gratitude. Maple didn't just protect our daughter. She opened doors for other children too. Doors that might have stayed closed if Karen had gotten away with it. I still get messages every week from people who heard the story. Some share their own. Others just want to say thank you. One woman wrote, "Your daughter's strength made me believe the world could still be kind." I read that one aloud to Emma. She smiled and said, "Maple would like that." We keep her collar hanging by the front door, not as a reminder of loss, but of love. Not as a symbol of pain, but of purpose. Karen took something from us, but she didn't break us. She made us stronger, whether she meant to or not. I'm not proud of everything I felt during those first few days. I had anger, real anger. But I'm proud of what we chose to do with it. We chose justice. We chose truth. We chose to speak up, even when it hurt. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever been made to feel small, to feel powerless in the face of cruelty, remember this. You're not alone. You matter. And even one voice, one small, shaking, hurting voice, can echo far enough to change something. It changed everything for us. Thanks for listening to my story. If anything here reminded you of your own life, drop a comment, like, and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you.